Good afternoon, and a welcome to all the people who are watching this very novel form of book launch, namely a virtual one in which you're not actually here to buy the books, which we hope you will do when you've heard the three speeches you're going to hear now, and secondly, when you've listened to some of the poems that Balázs Serta will be delivering in the course of the afternoon. So welcome. Secondly, I introduce myself. My name's John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute here in Budapest. And we are the co-publishers, along with the magazine Hungarian Review, of this book. This is a book entitled Down Fell the Statue of Goliath. It's a book of poems and short stories and literary reminiscences about 1956. One of the 2 or 3 most important years in the Hungarian history of the last 150 years. As we will be talking a lot about 56 in the course of talking about the book, I'm not going to say much more now, but we all will be saying something about 1956 later. So it's my great pleasure to introduce I've already introduced our actor friend who will be delivering the poems, and also now like to introduce 2 of the other speakers. First of all, Gyula Kadolányi, who is one of the 2 or 3 masterminds behind this book, who is its editor, who has devoted a great deal of his own literary work to making this an important as well as, I think, a powerful book. One which really brings home the impact of 1956 on individual lives and on the lives of the families of those who perished in extraordinary ways. The second speaker will be Balázs Orbán. Balázs Orbán is a senior official in the Hungarian government. He's the deputy head of the Prime Minister's office. We know him as someone who is deeply involved in culture and in the arguments, debates, and cultural productions that at this present time in history are proving to be some of the most thorny, but also some of the most inspiring political debates. So there are my 2 colleagues. I myself will now quietly resume my seat and invite Gyula Kadolányi to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. First of all, I would like to briefly introduce, for a start, our actor friend Balázs Serta, who will read one of the most famous poems about the revolution by György Fekete. Please.
György Fekete, You Shining Star, My 1956, translated by Peter Solman. Next morning, Wednesday, dust and cannon roar and suffering. But as I took the route that leads to Hero Square, I had to smile. There was no statue standing in the booths. On Thursday, fever glows on every face. By Thursday night, Földvári fell before the Rókus Hospital. The kids are armed inside the attic of the school next door. On Friday, more blood, tanks. I watch the field guns, their muzzle fire glitters in the dark. I shiver seeing the terrible beauty born here among us in the city park. The 6th day, pavements, fumigated corpses. On every breast a bunch of flowers lies. Republic Square, anxiety, some leaflets, a timid little rainbow in my eyes. The Writers' Union in jubilation, the lily scent of freedom and reprieve. Above the barricades and torn up tram lines, they started packing. They agreed to leave. 1703, then 1848, now 56. In every 100 years we stand up to our jailers. Come what may, I live to see the day through happy tears. Another Friday, standing by the Danube, the sun breaks through the smoky, misty air. Perhaps we will succeed. The sunset's purple brocade envelops Zsuzka's flaxen hair. Now Saturday. The morning is still hopeful. By night we know the knife is at our throats. The eastern sky is dark with dirty rain clouds. The west keeps belching pious antidotes. And so we went with the 200,000. I couldn't stand more jails. The country will be left behind, but always live inside me, her history, the shape of every hill. She is my country, and who cares if she has never cared for me? If I'll be clad with foreign earth one day, and if my son will not be Magyar and he'll call me dad. In 20 years, or maybe in 100, my dues will all be paid back by the young. They'll see my overcoat still in the hallways upon the coat stand, permanently hung. You, 1956, you're not my past, not history, and not a souvenir. You are inseparable from myself, my flesh, who came with me to enter here this unrelenting universe where floods of nothingness cascade in raging streams beneath a bridge without a rail. You gave a meaning to my life and daring dreams. You gave me appetite for suffering. You gave me joy. You held me by the hand when I was stumbling, and in later years you helped when I was getting out of wind. You shining star, my 1956, you eased my journey. There's so much you gave. You've shone for so long on my silver hair. Keep shining, shining bright above my grave.
Thank you for a truly beautiful rendering of this great poem. And as we learn from the poem itself, there's a hint in the poem to jails. And I think the life of György Fekete, who wrote this poem, is very emblematic of, I think, the life stories of Hungarians in mid-century, in the mid-20th century. He fought in the English army during the Second World War as I think he joined the English army during the Second World War. Then he came back to Hungary after liberation, and he participated in politics as a member of the Social Democratic Party. In 1950, he was arrested and imprisoned, and shortly before 1956, he was released from prison. And as he says in the poem, he doesn't want to be in jail again. So he left for the West and only came back after 1990. I also mention him because one of the best accounts that was ever written about the jail methods of the communists is his own autobiographical book, My Happy Days in Hell, which was published, I think, first in English and later on in Hungarian, and only smuggled, of course, into our country during communist governments. And Fekete also had a lot of humor, a sense of humor. And one of the finest incidents in his book is when one of the police officers who interrogates him At some point, he tells him, look, you know, I have a son who writes poems. Wouldn't you please look at these poems, but he should keep going on writing, you know? So next time, the officer brings an enormous suitcase with him full of manuscripts. And of course, Faludi immediately realizes that these are the poems of the police officer. So obviously he praises, I think, the poems and gets perhaps some free meals as a result. Let me say a few words about the genesis of this book. It was originally the inception of the book. The idea of the book was, I think, created by my longtime friend János Olah, poet, in 2015, and he worked on this anthology until his death in 2016. The anthology came out, the Hungarian edition came out in the Jubilee year, in the anniversary year of the revolution, the 50th anniversary. But the project of the English translation stalled because of his death. And then his poet wife, Katalin Mezei, who is also the head of the literature section of the Hungarian Academy of the Arts, came to us at Hungarian Review asking us to put together the English version of the anthology. And our editors, with an enormous experience, began to work feverishly. We invited Csilla Berta from Debrecen, and who had edited many anthologies of Hungarian poetry in English previously. And Csilla and myself have known most of the best translators of Hungarian writing into English from Budapest to Santa Barbara. So in an extremely short time, all the energy of the editorial team and our organizing work went into this project, and we came out with this rather substantial, and I think rather, as John O'Sullivan said, powerful book. This is the internal title page of the book, and Csilla Berta, who cannot be with us now because of like many other contributors, because of the pandemic, in the course of this very, very hasty work, took pains to critically comment on the translations. So, you know, she was carrying on a private conversation, private correspondence with the translators in the course of this work. The book finally came out in 2017. The book was very successful, also as far as sales go. Characteristically, a high number of copies were and are being sold at the House of Terror in Budapest. So I think those who visited Budapest and visited the place, the House of Terror was the one-time headquarters of the communist political police. Actually, the place where Faludi was interrogated, whom I mentioned. And obviously, under the effect of the visit, many people buy this anthology. So we now ran into a second edition, which again gave time to the editors, a possibility to our editors and to Csilla Berta to make some changes, to improve some of the translations and correct typos. The book was already but the book was ready for launch in the late 2019. But then, when we wanted to have a book launch, the pandemics came. Then, the pandemics were over, then summer came, not really a season for book launches. So then, autumn came and we were heading into the second wave of the pandemics. So ultimately we decided to have the book launch in this new format. We have to get accustomed to the new circumstances, and we are very grateful to the video team, which is here to broadcast our our occasion. To make this collection of the best writings springing from the 1956 experience has a special personal value. A poetry requiem entitled Clemency and a prose reminiscence records in this anthology the memory of one schoolboy, one of the thousands of martyrs of the revolution. His name is Arpad Andrei, and he was a schoolmate of mine, just short of his 15th birthday at the time, October 1956. His story unfolds from the dramatically clipped prose piece in this book written by novelist Rózsa Ignác, and soon we will hear a long passage from this prose piece. As it turned out, Arpad was permitted a 20-minute leave by his mother just to hang out with his pals. And they were never to see each other again. Muki was the nickname of my schoolmate, Arpad, walked 2 miles determinedly with his friends over Liberty Bridge, over the Danube, to Calvin Square, where the fighting went on unabated, and he joined the freedom fighters. He was shot the same evening on the doorsteps of a big building in fire from a Soviet machine gun, and died the following day singing the Hungarian national anthem on his deathbed. As it turns out, the son of the writer Rózsa Ignác, future poet Ádám Makkai, had been privately hired by the parents of Arpad to tutor him. He was a bright but unfettered boy. That year, Ádám, a university student, had been tutoring him. Later on, during his exile in the United States, Ádám Makkai wrote one of the most powerful writings of this book under the unforgettable effect of this tragedy. It is part of the story of our lives, I might say maybe the Hungarian nation in mid-century, that neither of the writings commemorating Arpad Andrei could be published in Hungary before 1990. Due to the communist terror following the revolution, I only became aware of the details of Muki's death when on New Year's Eve in 1972 with my wife, we visited Ádám Makkai in Chicago, where as a famous linguist he was teaching at the University of Illinois. For us, witnesses of the revolution of 1956, it is essential to see that the younger generations carry on the tradition of that event, which was the formative experience of our lives, relived in 1989-90. It is important to keep alive the memory that the nation can collectively rise against dictatorship out of righteousness in order to restore the eternal human values of sovereignty and community, out of decency and not the drive to destroy and kill, even though forced ultimately to take to arms. It is therefore very satisfying to us to share here tonight the reflections on that theme of Mr. Balázs Orbán, Deputy Minister of the Hungarian Prime Minister's Office. With the background in studies of law, history, and philosophy, Mr. Balázs Orbán represents the youngest Hungarian generation active in politics, as he serves at the cutting edge, where the Hungarian government has to renew day by day our definition of the values of nation, community, and cooperation with the nations of Europe in an ever-changing world. But before we hear Mr. Balázs Orbán, let us hear the passage I mentioned about the death of young Árpád Endre, and I'm asking Balázs Szirtes to take here my place. Thank you.
Rózsa Ignác, They Played at Truth, translated by Daniel Nashat. By the time he stumbles home, he has no human voice left. I don't ask. I touch him. He's alive. Then someone crashes in through the door, looking for someone to transport his son's body. Next week, he'd have been 14. The 20-year-old boy reels. His former student, Árpád Endre, 14 years old, a fallen hero. A hero. But little Endre, known as Muki to everyone in the area, was naughtier, more mischievous and determined than all the kids in the Port Street Boys gang, from the popular children's novel of the same name, put together. More daring and fearless was he than the little partisans promoted so eagerly by the communist youth guard. A thick-set, blue-eyed little Magyar. He had the best button football team in the district. If he paid attention for 5 minutes in class, he could have been a top student because his mind was as keen as a sharpened dagger. But Muki was always on the verge of flunking because he didn't pay attention. He could do the math without trying, but when it came to literature or history, he paid no mind to all that mumbo-jumbo. His father had once had him tutored by the older boy to get him in the habit of paying attention. Not even physical force would have been enough to hold Muki down and force him to focus on what had already driven the attentive older boy to the brink of a nervous breakdown. Muki did not discriminate between honorable and dishonorable subjects, but condemned every written word. The older boy explained in vain that dictation is spelled with T-I. Muki answered, I couldn't care less how you spell it. And when the older boy asked him nicely to attend his private lessons anyway, he said, I haven't got the time for that, Daddy-o. Muki didn't have time. He had some urgent playing to do, which couldn't wait. On Wednesday of the Holy Week of Revolution, he and 3 mates drilled the oil tank of a tracked vehicle. Then off he went to look around for just an hour, honest. He even signaled back in an hour to his mother through the window with his stumpy little index finger. When he was downed by a machine gun in Magyar Street, he could still say his name, address, and their telephone number. He lived for half a day after that. He said to tell his father and mother that he was sorry for bonking off. His chin was twisted outwards. His lung and liver shot through. He asked in wonder if he was going blind because he couldn't see. Then he sang. His voice was ragged now. Was he singing the song that had rung out in the street for 2 days? The words were no longer intelligible. The last thing he asked for was to be turned on his other side, because there's no sound coming from this side. And finally, I'm just dreaming, aren't I, miss?
Dear gentlemen, distinguished followers, October 23, 1956 is a day that will live forever in the annals of free men and nations. It was a day of courage, conscience, and triumph. No other day since history began has shown more clearly the eternal questionability of man's desire to be free, whatever the odds against success, whatever the sacrifice required. Such were the words of John Fitzgerald Kennedy when he took the Senate floor on the first anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. It seems that there is no aspect of Kennedy's character which he shared. There is one aspect of Kennedy's character which he shared with every Hungarian living today, and that was the unyielding love for freedom. For the last millennium, Hungarians have been living on the edge of Western civilization. They fought at the forefront against every invasion that came from the east, from the west, or from the south. Generation after generation grew up to be part of that effort, and just as the sword was passed from father to his son, so was the eternal desire to be free. Free of rulers born in faraway lands imposing their will on our people. For Hungarians, the freedom of the individual and of the nation became inseparable. Either all of us is free or none. In this corner of Europe, the word sovereignty is not merely a legal or a political concept, but a deeply embedded sense of who we are. That is why the people of Budapest stood up to face the greatest land force of the world in 1956. Not just became the communist tyrants, took away their personal freedoms, but because it is also stripped them of their liberty as a sovereign nation, making Hungary a mere vessel of the Soviet Empire. Whatever were the odds against success, whatever the sacrifice required, the heroes of 56 choose to rather die freely than to live as a nation of slaves. It is not only right, but imperative to remember the men and women who stood in face of death and persecution. Now it is our duty to prolong this generational contract through their legacy, and there is no better way to honor their sacrifice than through literature. The ideals of liberty have been a constant source of inspiration for the greatest writers throughout history. Revolutions cannot uphold the message of freedom long after the guns went silent. Their memories tend to fade, as all memories do, if no one is there to renew them from time to time. There are 3 types of freedom fighters, and all of them are needed to this enormous task. First, there are heroes who take up the arms if needed, who have the courage to man the barricades even against unspeakable odds. Then there are poets who sing about their sacrifice and through their works continue to do so long after their death. Finally, there is the rest of us. Those duty is to read, to remember, and to look into the past and the future. Political narratives are constantly changing, but literature can convey fundamental eternal values centuries after it was written. We know people have their differences. Politicians from the far side of the world may not agree with our reasoning, just as well we may not agree with theirs. But the language of literature is universal, regardless of who reads them. Homer, Tinodi, Wordsworth, or Márai has something to say to every person on earth. And that thing is the love of freedom. These poets understood their role within their nations, and so they became bridges that connect future generations to heroes of the past revolution. They help us realize why we need to fight ours, and so does our dear friend Gyula Kodolányi. This volume, edited by him, fulfills both purposes. It is a reminder for our generation to never lose sight of our duty, the beacon of light for darker days that may yet to come. But it is also a way of telling the world the tale of one Central European city, the city of Budapest, which 6 decades ago was willing to sacrifice everything in the name of freedom. History books speak only to the mind. The language of literature, however, delivers this tale directly into our heart. Now, Hungary and the West are in immense need of this sort of spiritual munition to stand up to future challenges. And we can be certain that we will face a great number of them. What we see today is the rise of different kind of intellectual invasion than those that we were used to in the past. With previously unknown tools and methods, the globalist progressive elite is currently in the progress of establishing a new supranational empire. Unelected, ruthless officials born in faraway lands are trying yet again to impose their will on people they know little about. Instead of celebrating the diversity of national cultures, these politicians are trying to create an equalized gray mass of individuals. Just like in the times of the revolution, religious views have no place in this new emerging Europe, nor does any independent morality or thought that springs up for them. Instead, we are told to adhere to their man-made standards of false morality, threatening us if we dare to refuse and choose to follow what we as a nation think in the right path. Fortunately, today's battles are not fought with rifles or grenades, or at least not yet. Instead, they take place in conference halls and courtrooms in form of formal debates. Nonetheless, Hungary takes these challenges very seriously because even though the circumstances shifted, the underlying principles remain the same. Through the legacy of our ancestors, we have learned that our personal liberties derive from the freedom of our nation. Nations, just like individuals, have their own distinct character, beliefs, habits, opinions, and values. This volume is nothing less than a treasury of the values Hungary has pledged to defend when it chose to join the Christian West. Never breaking away from this vow, Hungarians have protected them from ages and will continue to do so for centuries to come. For these values stem from the same common core, which is freedom. Freedom to choose what is right for us, for our families, for our communities, and for our nation. It is by no accident that President Kennedy said in October 23, "will live on forever in the annals of free men and nations." He knew, just as all Hungarians do, that one cannot exist without the other. We are only as free as our nation is. The heroes of 56 would have never let themselves to convince otherwise, and with the help of our great poets presenting the legacy for us, we will keep on marching in their path. So congratulations to our friend, as we call him, György bácsi, and thank you very much for your attention.
I'll follow your example. Perhaps I will not cough, not having this awful mask. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Balázs, and I hope that some of the addresses of this book launch, as well as the previous one last week, will be eventually printed in our journal. Last week on Thursday, I was following the book launch through the internet, and I was struck by, as I'm always, by the thoughts of my friend John O'Sullivan on the theme of Trianon. And today again, he has accepted our invitation to speak again, just as he has been for many years now a partner of our thinking processes in editing the journal. So I think how the writing in the book strikes a non-Hungarian reader, we will have the fortune to hear tonight from our highly esteemed and internationally known friend, John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute. Indeed, John is a mirror we like to hold up to us Hungarians, for he always teaches us to appreciate intellectual and spiritual strengths of Hungary and East Central Europe that we are rarely aware of. And he also notices shortcomings that we should improve on. My own friendship with John goes back to a time when we actually did not know each other. Born in the same year as myself, John was a special advisor to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at a time when I held the same position with József Antal, opposition leader and then the first Prime Minister of a newly democratic Hungary from May 1990. The two politicians had a deep respect and fond feelings for each other. And in a strange way, our friendship with John grows with the years, as we are still discovering ever new dimensions for us of the relevance of those two great strategists and great people, great human beings. As the saying goes, only those with an awareness of the past can have ideas for the future. John, please take our story. But before that, let's listen again to another passage. And yes, this is by one of our best national poets alive today, István Ág, who was there on Kossuth Square on October the 25th in 1956, one of the tens of thousands of demonstrators. And perhaps most of you know that after an interval of fraternizing with the Russian soldiers who were defending the parliament building, suddenly gunfire started from all directions. For many years, we didn't even know how many people died there, and it's very interesting. It's an interesting comment on how Hungarian history is just sort of still crawling out from the long shadow of communism that the older historians never really gave, even after 1990, the real figures. I think the realistic guesses are around 900 dead. And the shooting was going on with cool mind for 1 hour, I think. It's a terrible thing. And I was in hospital in late January next year. I broke my ankle. And there was an ambulance driver in the same room with me in the hospital. And he was shot on Kossuth Square while he was rushing for a wounded whom they wanted to take away in their ambulance. So, please, Balázs, do come and read your passage.
István Ág, The Blood of Falling Leaves, translated by Nicholas Bodotsky. I looked the other way and Kossuth Square exploded. I don't recall the moment, just like scientists cannot account for that infinitely tiny span of time in which the universe was born from nothing. I stood too far from the Ministry of Agriculture to run back under the archway because the guns were being fired from the roof of that building. It had to be a salvo of heavy weaponry, not the 1848 type rifles or papashas. I figured that the statue of Rákóczi would be a good shelter, but I was driven away by the dead bodies, so I fled, past toppling people and the sight of bursting intestines, reminiscent of pig killings, towards the embankment, but so the gunmen opposite. Led by the uncontrollable and unfathomable guidance of instincts, I lay flat on my face in the trench where the underground was being built behind the number 2 tram stop, landing right next to the boy in my year with whom I'd set off that morning, but had lost each other. The spot we were in wouldn't save us, because a tank that had turned up from Nádor Street could have caught us from the right. It was firing into the middle of the square, and again, with a sense of immortality, I watched the gun shaking under the weight of the shots, with the machine gun's fiery, icy white flashes coming from underneath. I watched the live war film. But then, the very real turret turned towards me, having done its first job, and moving on to the next. My friend shoved my head to the ground, and the shell exploded in front of us, covering us in black soil and mud. I cannot die. My neighbor's hat rolled over me. His body jerked. I hid underneath him, using him as a cover, as if there was any cover. My left thigh felt paralyzed, as though I'd been struck by electricity. I reached down and drew back a hand drenched in blood. There I was, lying in the exact spot where divine providence had placed me. A few inches to the right, and I'd be the dead body by my side. A few inches to the left, and I would have been mashed to pulp by the shell. My friend's arm had been mushed to pulp, by the way. Had I been lying lower, the shrapnel would have killed me. The madness of the half-dead seized us. The tank crawled up behind us, trampling over everything. Oh, Donny, darling, where are you? Stop climbing over me, do you hear me? The silence of the end of time ensued. My friend and I, clinging together, armless and legless, fell in the door of the Ministry of Construction, exposed to gunfire. It was as if I'd walked many meters legless, eventually collapsing in the arms of a nurse and ending up in a cellar where 50 wounded people were passing around a bottle of cognac. We are alive. I became aware that I was alive. Lord, I partook the Eucharist. I partook of the Eucharist, the neat spirits of your grace. I flew, my Lord. We were transported on the back of trucks, me to Tétényi Hospital. Lying on a stretcher, I looked around the square. The sight in itself from that angle would have made me turn grey. Seeing what happened after I'd been lying there. Like after a battue shooting, the saying to bite the dust is true. Dying people were biting the earth, clutching the roots of the turf. For me, it was a grey sky above, the lip-biting endlessness of the rattle aboard the truck in the quest for survival. I was still bleeding after being bandaged because the medics had failed to notice the other wound. There was a piece of shrapnel at the front, still encased there. At the back, a gaping hole of carved-out flesh, torn muscle, but unscathed bones and nerves. I authenticated my identity with a bloody fingerprint under the photograph in the dark, red-colored ID.
First of all, may I once again thank Gyula for this event and for producing the book which we are celebrating. He has said nice things about me, but I have to begin by thanking him for inviting me to speak here, because my credentials for doing so are slight. I'm neither Hungarian, nor a poet, nor a novelist, nor a writer of imaginative and creative works, but a journalist and a cold-blooded political analyst. So my only justification for being here is that I believe the book to be an important one that deserves to be read, not only in Hungary and in the Hungarian diaspora, where it will be appreciated, indeed treasured, but also read by those abroad who need to be reminded of what the Hungarian Revolution was and why it should be cherished by decent people, all decent people. We need, in other words, to remind the world of what it felt spontaneously at the time, but what it is probably now forgotten. As such, this book is in one sense a quixotic enterprise. It's a collection of prose and poetic responses to a revolution and a war of independence. The responses glow with many emotions, with compassion, with regret, with rage, with tenderness, but above all, with pride. And that's an oddity. I don't think I need spend time demonstrating how rare it is for a war or a revolution to be celebrated or even just remembered with pride, at least in the world of literature. War poems today are almost always anti-war poems and have been since the Great War of 1914-1918. That's understandable. And in most cases, it's creditable. It is sensible to wish not to be killed, and it's an elementary decency to wish not to kill other people. One can make only the most qualified arguments for engaging in a war, namely that it is sometimes preferable to things much worse, things such as slavery or gross injustice or genocide or mass murder. Even then, the decision to take up arms has to pass a series of moral tests, which can be summed up in the question, is the outcome of a war or a revolution certain to be, or almost certain to be, an improvement on the status quo? The end result of those questions is a strong predisposition not to start or enter a military conflict voluntarily and to be critical of those who do. Now, human beings have not always felt this, and they will not always feel this. In the future, we are both surprised or disturbed when we read how the young men of England and Germany and their allies in Hungary and Italy and other countries march off gladly to war and in moods of optimistic and passionate patriotism. It seems, when we look back, naive and superficial, and an invitation to disillusionment. In fact, disillusionment did not occur at the time. While that war continued, most people remained patriotic and supportive. But as the corpses mounted, their patriotism had to be expressed in a minor key. So we find deeply somber poetic expressions of the same bellicose sentiments that were sung and shouted joyfully in August 1914. One of the most powerful patriotic poems in English to emerge from the First World War was written by a young Canadian doctor in 1915 following his friend's death in battle. It's called In Flanders Fields, and it's still read on Remembrance Day, the 11th of November in England. It still packs a punch. Some of its impact comes from the melancholy fact that the voices speaking in the poem are those of the dead soldiers buried where the poppies grow in Flanders. Let me quote two stanzas from it. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. But these voices in that early poem counsel not peace and forgiveness, but revenge and renewed determination to press on to victory. Let me quote the second stanza. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. A reason why these sentiments are now heard less often, and why the First World War poems we tend to quote and to anthologize express much more pacifistic sentiments, is because of what happened after the war. What was supported as the war to end all wars ended, in the words of Lord Wavell, as the peace to end all peace. That cast a retrospective light of disillusionment over any more positive interpretations of the Great War. And as Hemingway expressed one of the most influential responses to the war when he developed a staccato typewriter English that consciously avoided any of the $10 words, such as, well, patriotism. That disillusionment flowered into a literary orthodoxy almost a decade after the war, following novels like All Quiet on the Western Front and the growing popularity of the English war poets. Disillusionment seemed to fade briefly when the Spanish Civil War aroused a generation of young left-wing idealists and inspired them to leave their countries and to join the anti-fascist forces defending the Republic. Poets, novelists, journalists contributed to a 1937 book in England entitled Authors Take Sides in the Spanish War. Almost all of them took sides against Franco, and they were eager for intervention by London and Paris to save the Republic. Among them was W.H. Auden, who published a poem, now celebrated, of course, famous rather, titled simply Spain, that included these lines. Tomorrow for the young, the poets exploding like bombs, the walks by the lake, the weeks of perfect communion, tomorrow the bicycle races through suburbs on summer evenings, but today the struggle. Today the deliberate increase in the chances of death, the conscious acceptance of guilt in the necessary murder, today the expending of powers on the flat ephemeral pamphlet and the boring meeting. It was a little hard to maintain this attitude when it became clear, after Orwell's homage to Catalonia, that the war had not been a pure battle for the just city against the fascists, but a smokescreen, behind which Stalin's agents, including Erno Gero, the principal mass murderer in 1956, had been decimating the idealistic ranks of the non-communist left in Spain. Auden, in response to these facts, altered the lines I just quoted to remove the phrase necessary murder, and he wouldn't publish the poem in his collected works because he thought it rhetorically dishonest. Disillusionment thus revived again until the Nazi-Soviet pact in August 1939 and the opening of the Second World War. For the next 2 years, the literary left maintained a pose of disillusion because following the Comintern orders, they treated the war as one between indistinguishable capitalist states from which socialists should hold themselves aloof. But this pose was an insincere one, reflecting and imitating the somersaults of Kremlin policy. It was promptly abandoned when Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded Russia. Communists throughout the world and the West became jingoists for Moscow overnight. On the right, however, the Nazi-Soviet pact, I'm talking here about literature, particularly English literature, the Nazi-Soviet pact had provoked a more substantial illusion and a subsequent greater sense of self-deception. Evelyn Waugh had been one of the 5 writers in the Spanish War Symposium to oppose support for the Republic on the grounds that it was rooted in ignorance of Spanish realities. But in his great trilogy on the Second World War, The Sword of Honor, which in my view should be better known in Central Europe and Hungary in particular, Waugh has his gentlemanly English Catholic hero, Guy Crouchback, responding to the news of the Nazi-Soviet pact with a similar commitment to a battle for chivalric ideals. He wrote, "The enemy at last," this is the Nazi-Soviet pact, "the enemy at last was plain in view, huge and hateful, all disguise cast off. It was the modern age in arms. Whatever the outcome, there was a place for him in that battle," unquote. By the end of the novel, however, the Soviet Union is one of the victors. It has occupied half of Europe, including countries that Britain went to war to protect. The West has accepted this divided Europe in the conflict. Guy himself feels the futility of the war for these ideals. A Jewish woman, whom he tries to protect from Tito's communists, ineffectually, as it turns out, his help compromises her. She tells him, "It seems there was a will to war, a death wish everywhere. Even good men thought that their private honor would be satisfied with war. They could assert their manhood by killing and being killed. They would accept hardships in compensation for having been selfish and lazy. Danger justified privilege. I knew Italians, not very many perhaps, who felt this. Were there none in England? God forgive me," said Guy. "I was one of them." Now, that was not a judgment that most English people could feel in 1945, or for a long time afterwards. At that time, it would have been more readily understood in the half of Europe separated by Yalta. But by 1956, this disillusionment with chivalric or martial ideas, or even just ordinary love of country, was again compulsory in the world of words. There was almost a literary taboo against poetry or imaginative prose that treated heroism, self-sacrifice, or love of country in anything other than a disapproving, pacifist way. Patriotism was just about acceptable as a sort of green environmentalism, but it was frowned on as a political or moral statement of any other kind. I imagine that in Central Europe, it was further discredited by the cranking out of Soviet-style proletarian nationalism in the controlled media of the regimes. Not least, it was reinforced everywhere by the fear, both real and cultivated, of nuclear weapons that had the potential to destroy all life and indeed all mankind. Yet in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution broke through this rooted sentiment of the artistic world and the intellectual public, and won their unstinting admiration and support. Today, this selection of poems, diary entries, letters, short stories, and other works of the mind and imagination, stimulated by 1956 or in response to it, reads as that very unlikely paradox, the celebration of a tragedy. Against all the odds, it elevates courage and it puts disillusionment to flight. I don't think I can explain why it has these effects. One can't really explain a poem or how it stirs us, since the same poem can elicit very different reactions from different people. All one can say really is read the thing and feel for yourself. But I can throw out a few simple and obvious ideas on why our reactions to 1956 are so powerfully similar to the reactions of other people, while yet diverging sharply from our reactions to the earlier works discussed in these remarks. To begin with, though there are modernist works in the volume, there's no hint of modernist ambiguity here, nor was there in the actual events of 1956. The revolution was 2 weeks, snatched from the heroic age and plonked down in the middle of the 20th century. Time magazine famously put a cover on its Man of the Year issue of a Hungarian revolutionary. There's also, incidentally, a revolutionary Hungarian woman visible over his shoulders. And for once, that expressed an almost universal opinion. We had all been praising and acclaiming the modernist anti-hero in the novels, plays, and films of the 1950s and later. In 1956 also, the famous play Look Back in Anger, which changed English playwriting for a generation, had as its central figure the anti-hero Jimmy Porter, who famously said in the play, "There are no good causes to fight for anymore." We liked these things, we lived these things, but we did so with some doubts. And it was a relief, in a way, to run into heroes who recognized evil, fought it bravely, and for a moment seemed to prevail, without constantly second-guessing their own motives or looking on dispassionately as their fate was decided. Nor were we in any way tempted to sympathize with his oppressor, the oppressor of the Hungarian hero, who happened also to be the oppressor of all. This volume's title, Down Fell the Statue of Goliath, is alone enough to explain the West's admiration for 56 and the loving celebration, and it receives here. There could be no sympathy for a totalitarian regime that ran its tanks over people's bodies and their hopes. Thus, there could be no disillusionment with resistance to Goliath, whether it was successful or failed. So when his statue was pulled down, even the ranks of Tuscany could scarce forbear to cheer. Reporters for communist papers in the West resigned and wrote the truth of what they saw. Truthful communist reporting, itself a remarkable literary novelty. It helped that the revolution was not a battle for someone else's territory or for any objective with even a hint of moral taint. It was a revolution by ordinary people, by workers as well as by students, to recover the simple personal liberty that people throughout Western Europe already took for granted. But it was also a popular national revolution to recover the independence of the country from an occupying power. It was a Hungarian revolution in which Hungarians from almost every political faction took part, with none of them maneuvering carefully to calculate how they each might emerge on top of the heap in a future Hungarian democracy. And alas, there was no Hungarian democracy in their future, not for another 30 years spent by the survivors crossing a desert of national betrayal and political seduction, until eventually the promise of 1956 was finally redeemed. Just as Hungary had wounded Goliath deeply in 56, so a later Hungary outwitted Goliath in 1989 and brought down not the statue, but the monster itself by holding a picnic to conceal a flight of his captives, a very Hungarian finale. Thousands of Hungarians, young and old, never lived to see that day of liberation. Some died in battle, some in the prisons and labor camps of Goliath, some in exile. But in those 2 short weeks, they had achieved astounding things. As well as wounding Goliath, as it turned out fatally, they had wiped away the memory of 1944 and 1945 with all their crimes and sad ambiguities. They had changed how the world saw Goliath. Yes, but they had changed how the world saw Hungary and Hungarians, not as bittersweet ironists, witty pessimists with the death wish, sophisticated bystanders of history, but as young gallants of both sexes, gambling against great odds and turning their losses into heroic reputation. Of course, that heroism had always been there, but now the world could see it unclouded. Even in the world of words, they put disillusionment to flight too. As this volume demonstrates on page after page, they forced the world to concede that bravery, self-sacrifice, and love of country and love of one's fellow countrymen are qualities we need for those moments and great causes that come along rarely, sometimes very inconveniently, but always compellingly. Goliath learned that. The rest of us should not forget it. I mentioned Jimmy Porter's remark. I should say two things finally. One is that disillusionment itself is justified when the causes are embraced that call for sacrifice, but dishonestly do not acknowledge the real weight of the sacrifice involved. In story after story, the heroes, the heroines, and their families suffer greatly for their heroism. There is no necessity for disillusionment when people unflinchingly face the reality of the sacrifices they make and the risks they take. Jimmy Porter, I quoted a moment ago, John Osborne is the writer, Jimmy Porter, the character, for saying, it was our parents, they solved all those big major crises in the past. There are no brave causes for us to fight for anymore. 1956 showed, and we should realize, that there are always good, brave causes to fight for, and as this book shows again and again on every page, very occasionally there are good, brave people who fight for them. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. I was certain that I may express my high expectations for what you are going to say, and let me say that my expectations proved right. Thank you so much for this very moving address. And as to close down our evening, I'm asking Balázs Szirtes to read two more poems.
Ferenc Buda, Snowfall in Budapest, translated by Peter Cipot. The snow is falling on Budapest. It eddies, churns, and swirls. Onto the Danube's ripples, onto the soulless rubble, onto window eyes shot through, onto people's mouth turned blue, onto chapel and its chemical works, onto the castle where nothing stirs, on wounds with ragged borders, on workshops and defiant workers, on blood dried on the asphalt, as white as a corpse it falls. Wind sweeps it along the pavement. Wind lofts it across the firmament. The snow is falling on Budapest. As fresh binding on open sores, bashed, snow white down to its toes. György Gömöri thus entreats anyone who still believes. Translated by Thomas Cooper. God, who put the revolution in the depth of our minds, fanned the slender flame of conscience until it blazed to the skies, that the world might finally awaken to our flickering signal fire. Help, O Lord, this people, aborted in the womb of fate, its noble, dear face trampled underfoot by soldiers. For God, it cannot be that it's all the same in the end, that you have promised evil a nation for eternity, that perhaps never will you lift the cross from our shoulders, but rather have ordained your Son's sufferings on us, until at our last breath the churches crack and fall asunder. God, who wanted the revolution and planted it in us, who were with us in the dreamlike shimmer of that resplendent afternoon when the elderly burst into tears to have lived to see the day. Help, O Lord, this people whom none have ever understood. Its every yearning become but hope, its every bud blighted by cold.
Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for our contributors of this evening. And please keep this evening in your minds, and please read the writings. Thank you.